So today we have a recording with a client. This is the work I do. I help dentists determine if a practice is worth buying. If you want to follow along, there's a link in the description to the practice evaluation checklist. There's a 44-page document that goes and outlines exactly what you're looking for when you buy a practice, as well as the final sheet, which is actually the worksheet that we're going to be filling out on today's call, where we're actually looking at all the specifics of the practice to determine if this practice is worth buying. So you can find that in the description. Everything is going to be anonymous in this video. We're not going to show his face. We're going to use a pseudonym. I wanted to make sure that he would be willing and open to be completely honest about all the numbers, about his finances. So I promised him I wouldn't let his name or his face out on the internet. But here is a call so you can get an idea of what it is like to actually go through and look at a practice to buy. I think if you watch this, you're going to find a lot of potential details that could apply to another practice that you're looking at. Every practice is going to have some advantages and disadvantages. My goal is to help my clients understand exactly what those advantages and disadvantages are so that you can be as prepared as possible when you take over the practice. If you find this useful, leave a comment, send me an email, let me know, and we can do more like this. Here we go. All right, we're here today with Dr. Orange. Obviously, that's a pseudonym. We're going to block his face off to keep everything anonymous. Obviously, this has to be completely confidential. But we're going to go through, he has found a practice that he's considering buying, and we're going to look at to see if this is a practice that's worth buying. We're going to do the evaluation. We have a checklist here, the practice evaluation checklist that we are going to fill out, and that's going to help us determine if the qualifications of this practice meet what he's looking for.
So I'm an associate dentist right now. I worked at a DSO for a year, where I was the only dentist there, and then I got approached by somebody I shadowed in college, and he asked me to be an associate with him, so I've been working with him for around 4 years. It's been great, no problems there. I just think that it's time. I've done my 5 years out of school. I did call an email quite a few brokers, but I wasn't really getting any feedback. I did know of an older dentist because I'm from the area that I live in right now, so I knew about this dentist before. I actually shadowed him in dental school. I didn't want to ask him if he was selling because I felt uncomfortable. Because I knew he was a little older. He was like mid-60s to upper 60s. So I knew he was probably getting around that time to wanting to retire. So what I did was I called around to different supply reps, and I asked, hey, do you sell to so-and-so? And then when I found out who did, I asked the sales rep, I said, hey, do you think they're going to sell anytime soon? So the sales rep was like, oh, I think he might. So that's how I kind of got this relationship with the sales rep. The owner doc isn't really ready to sell yet, so he's been showing me different ones, and this is one of them.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So the equipment rep has been showing you a couple practices.
Mm-hmm. The equipment rep, their company also has like a brokerage.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been working too well with the brokers that they use. So
really?
the selling dentists like the equipment rep more, and apparently he can help sell them too. He's kind of like he's not really a broker, but he kind of does that a little bit.
Do you know if he's charging a fee to the seller, or he's just doing it because he wants to get the service from you later?
See, that part I'm not sure, because he did hook me up with a broker.
Yeah.
So that was going to be like a normal transaction, but now that the selling dentists don't want to use that broker, they just want to use him. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, it doesn't really matter for you because the seller pays the fee for the broker. If there is a fee, that's going to be, the seller is going to be paying that. So it really doesn't affect you. Your main goal is to see if this is a practice that you would want to be in long term, and if it's going to be profitable for you when you take it over.
Right.
Name of seller for this, we're going to leave it blank for now, obviously, for the confidentiality. Name of broker, question mark on that if there's a broker or not. This is an interesting use case. Office address, we're leaving that blank. So do we know the number of operatories that's in this office?
5.
5. That's a good number. I really wouldn't buy an office that has way fewer than 5 operatories. So 5's a good number. If you can find one with more, that's better. Sometimes you have to buy one with less, but the thing is, like, once you get up and running, you want to have like 2 hygienists, and then you want to at least have 2 operatories, ideally 3 for yourself. And if you ever want to have an associate in there, then you're going to need at least 7 operatories. So that associate can have 2. And then if one of the chairs is broken for whatever reason, it's nice to have an additional operatory. So now you need 8. So any less than 5 is a little bit risky to buy. If it's the perfect practice, other than that, it still might be worth buying. But if you have the option, the more ops, the better.
So the owner owns the building.
Yeah.
And there's a second story that's completely, maybe what could be done is move some of like the break rooms and other things upstairs, and maybe put like one more in.
Yeah, that's a good option. Yeah, it might be hard for the patients to walk up and down the stairs, But if the break room is upstairs, the staff can walk up and downstairs.
Yeah,
or put storage up there. So 5 with option to expand. Have you heard yet what a proposed sale price is going to be for this practice?
I think it was like 1.1.
Okay. So around 1.1 million. Most practices are going to sell anywhere from, I've seen on the low end, 100,000 for like a really, really small practice. And when practices get really big, multiple doctors, I've seen them sell for as much as 4 or 5 million. If you're a solo doctor, you're usually going to be looking at practices that are in the range of 500,000 to about 1.5 million. That's kind of the range. This is right within that range of what would be kind of a decent practice for a solo doctor to buy. Right off the bat, I am seeing, though, with it being 1.1 million, it's possibly that it's going to be on the bigger side of things. And so you might actually be at a point where you're going to want to hire an associate relatively soon, maybe within the first few years. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, do we know the reason that this seller is wanting to sell the practice?
Yeah, the seller getting a little older and just wants to enjoy the later years in life and spend some time with the grandkids and that's not worry about dealing with staying open to pay the employees and just take off for,
Yeah. Do you know roughly how old the seller is?
Early 60s.
Okay. Yeah, so that's pretty typical. It's a good thing that the seller is actually planning on retiring. Of course, you want to verify to make sure the seller is going to retire. What you don't want to happen is that the seller says he's going to retire and then he moves across the street and opens up another practice or goes and works at a competitor and brings a bunch of those patients with him, because that can result in you losing a lot of the patients that you were planning on having. But it sounds like, retirement is definitely the best reason. Occasionally you'll get into a scenario where the seller is not planning on retiring and is planning on staying and working in town. If you are in that kind of situation, or maybe the seller has another practice that they're planning on going to work at, that can be really risky, because like we just said, they could take patients with them and go over. But retirement is the best reason for selling. I would say you still are going to have the seller sign a non-compete agreement, and you want to ask a few more questions before buying the practice, just to make sure that they have plans. Maybe you said they have grandchildren that they want to go and visit. That's good. What are they going to be doing after retirement? Because sometimes dentists, or really anyone, will retire and then realize, hey, I'm actually kind of bored and I want to go back to work. And so ideally the seller has some sort of plan of what they're going to be doing once they retire, because that's going to help to reduce the risk of the seller taking over another practice and potentially messing up your business.
Besides that, I wonder why would somebody just sell their practice just to open another one for tax?
I mean, there's lots of reasons. I know a dentist who sold his practice because he was getting a divorce, and legally he had to split up the assets. And so he sold it with the intention of his wife getting half of those funds, or ex-wife getting half of those funds. For some dentists, the equity that they have in their practice is actually a lot of the value that they have. They might have some money in like a savings account or an investment account, but because they've been paying off practice loans year after year, the practice that they have might be worth $1.5 million, and they might only have a few $100,000 in savings. And so if they are in a situation where they're going through a divorce and have to split, $700,000 with one party, 7 with the other, they might have to sell the practice or else take out another loan on that practice in order to produce those funds. And so I've seen that scenario quite a bit, actually. Other reasons sellers might want to sell is maybe they just want to move, they want to go somewhere else. But the biggest risk is if the seller is selling the practice because there's something wrong with the practice. Maybe they did some sort of malpractice and they're trying to get away from. Maybe the patients just aren't very good. Maybe the practice is in a location where they're having a really hard time finding new patients and they're just trying to sell so that they can get a better practice. You don't want to be the sucker who comes in and buys that bad practice when they're already making plans to build a much nicer practice not that far away. And especially if they build a nicer practice and they have relationships with those patients, the patients might say, hey, I'm going to go to the dentist that I am used to seeing, and he has a brand new building, which is nicer, so I'm going to go over there. So that's the biggest risk when you buy a practice, is that the seller is somehow going to interfere with your patients in the future. Do we know, does the seller own the building?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Have you yet gotten to the point where you discuss if you would be potentially buying the building, or is the seller wanting to lease that out to you?
I think what it was is they gave the option. I don't think I would want to buy it right now.
Yeah.
Especially, taking out that loan for that just to practice. But I think what we had talked about already is getting the right for first refusal.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
Do they give any numbers yet of how much they would want for rent, or if you did purchase, how much they would want to sell for? So we don't know that yet. So that's one of the things down here in financial health. Eventually, before moving forward with this, we're going to need to figure that out, because so monthly rent and total payroll, those are the two biggest numbers as far as the expenses from the seller that we need to look at. Because how much money you spend on your lab bill, how much money you spend on supplies and equipment and stuff, that's all going to be based on however you want to run the business. You can change the business, you can change the expenses, but the two big expenses that are going to be fixed expenses are going to be the rent that you're paying and the payroll for their staff. Technically, you could change the payroll of your staff, but generally, when you take over a practice, the staff are not going to be happy if you come in and lower the amount that they're being paid. And you really don't want to let people go right away unless they're just really bad employees, because part of the goodwill with the practice that you're buying is the patients have relationships with the staff that's at the practice. So payroll, at least at first, is fixed, and rent is likely going to be completely fixed. So you don't want to buy a practice where the rent is going to be ridiculously high. Usually you want your rent to be around 5% of the total office production, and payroll, you want to try to keep that under 30%. Payroll is going to be your biggest expense. Rent is usually not that big of an expense relative to payroll and some of the other expenses, but because it's fixed, it's something you want to focus on making sure you keep down. Do we know how many employees are at this practice?
There's 2.5 hygienists.
Okay, that's good.
So,
that's very good, actually.
And then there's 2 assistants, and then I think there's 2 front desks.
Is one of the front desks considered an office manager, or are they just calling them front desk right now?
I think it's just front desk.
2 front desks, okay. So right off the bat, the fact that there are 2.5 hygienists, that's a very, very good sign. The number of hygienists at a practice is one of the ways we determine how many patients there are at a practice and how many recall patients there are, because the hygienists are only able to see a certain amount of patients per day, obviously, because they're doing the cleanings. And so the fact that the seller had to hire additional hygienists means that there was patient flow necessary to hire those hygienists.
Hopefully.
So, yeah, hopefully. But that's part of the due diligence when we actually look at the practice. We want to go through the seller's practice management software, and we want to look at the schedules, and we want to see, are these hygienist schedules actually full? In an ideal world, we go in and all 2.5 hygiene schedules are completely filled, and they have a waiting list of patients that are trying to get on. That's ideal. It doesn't always work out that way. I always recommend when you go and look at the practice, go back a month or two and just count how many patients there were seen, at least in a week, maybe in a month if you have the time, how many hygiene patients were seen. And then if you multiply that number out, you can get an estimate of how many patients there are at the practice based upon that. And then you can go forward and look ahead a few months and see, have these patients been scheduled to come back? Because most offices are scheduling their patients 6 months in advance. That's the best way to do it, because you want to have these patients come back. And so you should be able to look back a few months and ahead a few months, and the numbers should be roughly the same, and you should be able to get a rough idea of how many patients there are on the hygiene system just by looking at the schedule. All right, so next section we want to look at is, we always want to look at the profit and loss statements. That's how we get just the basic idea of how big the practice is, what their expenses are like, and what the profit is for the seller. So we've already gone through, and we do have the previous 3 years of profit and loss statements. And the key numbers we're going to look at here are going to be the revenue and the net income. Now, when you initially look at a profit and loss statement, you can't necessarily trust the net income number that's listed there. And the reason is because a lot of dentists, for tax purposes, will intentionally try to reduce that net income number. And they do that oftentimes by billing things that are actually really personal expenses through the business. For instance, cell phone bills. Some dentists will figure out how to put their car through the business. Like, there's all sorts of things that you can run through the business to make it look like your income number is lower. There's also ways you can depreciate expenses and other types of legal and accounting type things to lower that net income number. And so before you actually decide what that net income number is, you have to add back some of those expenses. All right. So for the year 2024, we have 1.5 million. For 2023, we have 1.3 million. And then in 2022, we also had 1.3 million. The only reason we look at all 3 years is to make sure that they're fairly consistent. If you have like a really sharp jump or a really sharp drop in one of the years, you need to figure out why that is. One of the biggest problems I've seen is if you have a practice where they're doing like 700,000, and then 1.4 million, that big jump shows that the seller is probably overproducing in a massive way in order to quickly try to get the value of their practice up right before they sell. In this case, we have 1.3, 1.3, 1.5. Numbers are pretty close. I mean, it's a little bit higher in the last year. It's actually a good thing if you see at least a little bit of a trend up, especially if that is because the number of patients at the practice are increasing. So it might be good to ask, we have 2.5 hygienists right now. Was that 0.5 hygienists added in this last year? Is that kind of maybe one of the reasons production went up? If so, that's actually a good sign because that means the number of patients is increasing. This is a really good practice. Right off the bat, I am seeing the net income listed on the profit and loss statement is $630,000, but they also have a line for owner's salary, which is $154. So at the very least, we're gonna add the 630 to the 154. This printout's a little bit hard to see, so I'm trying to look at exactly what these expenses are. Before actually buying this practice, obviously we'd wanna get a clearer printout so we could see a little bit better. But we've got some travel expenses here. We have licensing and permits included here. Like that's something when you have to get your license renewed and you're an associate, you're paying that out of pocket. But when you have a business, the business can pay for that kind of thing. CE is another thing that when you're an associate, you probably have to pay for, but when you own the business can pay for it. Your general liability, your malpractice, business is paying the malpractice. Dues and subscriptions, business is paying that. Now, here's something interesting. They are spending about $40,000 on marketing expenses. Do you have any idea of what kind of marketing they're doing right now? Overall, though, it seems like it's working. I mean, $40,000 spend on marketing. Here it says it's 2.5% of revenue. That's really not that bad for the amount that this practice is generating. To only be spending that on marketing is actually really good. And so obviously you want to try to figure out exactly what the seller is doing for marketing. Probably you want to just try to continue, at least for the first year, what the seller was doing just to kind of maintain. But after that, you can decide, does it make sense to put more money into marketing? Or maybe you don't even need to put any money into marketing. A lot of practices that don't spend any money on marketing. And also we have to look at exactly what that is. For instance, some people will include their website bills or phone bills as marketing, which I don't think this seller has done that. I think they broke it out a little bit better than that. But when you look at a profit and loss statement, every dentist is going to have their own accountant and their own way of doing things, and things are going to be categorized a little bit differently. And so you do have to ask some questions to figure out exactly what's going on here. But just an initial number here, we have about 630 income, 120 owner salary, and then maybe about another 20,000 in discretionary expenses that we're going to add back in. So the seller's total net income last year was 770. That's a pretty good income. There are very few associate dentists that are going to be making $770,000 a year. You pretty much have to be an owner if you want to make that type of money. Quickly, we'll go through 2023. So last year, the owner made about $625,000, and in 2022, the number was about the same. It was about $590,000.
I was just saying, so when the dentist paid themselves, what did you say that the dentist salary was on that?
Last year was $770.
No, I'm talking about the dentist paid them. Remember, it was the dentist salary on there.
Yeah, so in 2024, the dentist paid themselves a salary of $120, and then their owner's portion was what made up the rest of that. The reason that you do that is because when you have a corporation, the government requires you to pay yourself a reasonable salary, because the salary that you pay yourself is taxed a little bit differently than the money that you get from being the owner of the business. This is not something you need to understand yourself. This is why you hire an accountant to take care of these kind of things. So similar to revenue, how revenue increased over the last year, there was also an increase in net income. Basically, that total increase in revenue went straight to net income. So the dentist was able to increase the production without actually really increasing expenses by much. Next thing we need to look at is what was total payroll during the last year. All right, so here we go. Payroll expenses is $361,000, which that is only 23.9% of last year's revenue. Ideally, you want to keep this number under 30%. This one's quite a bit under 30%. 23%, that's about as good as you're probably going to be able to do out of practice. That's a really low number for payroll. So that's very good. If you can maintain the seller's production without having to hire any additional staff or increase their pay rate, then that's really good for you. Okay, so this gives us a pretty decent picture of the financial health. Overall, the practice is very healthy. This is a great practice. If you were the owner of this practice, that would be awesome. Now, the real question though is, when you buy the practice, are you gonna be able to replicate what the seller was doing? Are you gonna be able to make that $770,000 in the first year that you buy this practice? And that's really why we need to look at the production by procedure report. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look at what procedures the seller was doing in order to produce that 1.5 million. Was the seller over treatment planning on patients? Was the seller under treatment planning on patients? Was the seller doing a lot of specialty work that you're not able to do or don't want to do? Or was the seller just doing general dentistry and you like doing specialty work and you're going to come in and add value? These are the kind of things we need to look at.
When I was looking at your video and you were talking about the periodic exams and comprehensive exams,
Yeah.
Because what you told me with the active patients doesn't really match up with what...
You're saying the number that they listed as having as active patients?
Mm-hmm. Their number is higher than what I think shows on there.
Almost always the broker and the practice management software is going to give you an inflated number for active patients. And so that's why you always have to calculate it yourself. The best, or at least the easiest ways to calculate the number, the best way would be to stand there for a year and a half and count how many patients come in. But like the most reasonable way to figure out this number is, one thing we already talked about is going and looking at the schedule and actually counting how many patients there are in a month on a hygiene schedule and then multiplying that out. The other way is by looking at the production by procedure report, which we're about to do. And we can look at two different numbers on there. We can look at periodic exams and we can look at number of prophies. And also we need to take into account any type of scalings that were done, because sometimes we have to add that to prophies. Some practices do a lot of scalings, others do zero. And so that's totally dependent on the practice. But if we look at the number of periodic exams, that gives us an idea of how many times the dentist actually examined a recall patient. Yeah. Now, some dentists will do a periodic exam at every single appointment that the patient comes in, which that's the ideal way to do it. Every time the patient is getting a prophy, they're getting a periodic exam. However, in some states, that's not actually required. And so some dentists will only do an exam every other appointment because they just don't want to have to waste the time on the hygiene check. If you're super busy and to you it's not worth it to do that exam, that's probably fine. You're losing out a little bit of money because the insurance would pay you for that exam. But especially if you're the type of dentist where you're doing, complex procedures, endo, implants, and you don't want to have to be bothered to do exams, it might make sense to just have exams every other appointment, which it just depends on your business and how you have it set up. But when you look at these numbers, you need to get an idea. If the periodic exam number and the prophy number are pretty similar, then you know that the dentist is doing periodic exams at every prophy. If the periodic exam number is much lower than prophy number, then probably the dentist is doing every other exam.
Yeah.
Here we have the production by procedure report. In this case, we don't actually have 2024 numbers yet. Obviously, before actually buying this practice, we're going to want to figure those out, what they are. But we do have the 2023. And because the revenue in 2023 and 2024 are pretty close, I think this is going to give us a pretty decent idea of what this practice is looking like. So let's look and see how many periodic exams were done. So periodic exams in 2023, there were 679. Now let's see how many prophies there were. There were 901 prophies done.
So that's kind of like cleanings.
Yeah. So for the size of this practice, that's a little bit on the low end for the number of periodic exams and the number of prophies that were done. Now, another number that's good to look at that we don't have on here is the number of new patients. And to find the number of new patients, we're going to look at the number of comp exams. New patients, there are 403. So that's a decent number of new patients. Now, the dentist is spending about $40,000 a year on marketing in order to get those new patients. Once we get the 2024 numbers, I'll be very interested to see if the number of recall exams has increased. Because we have 403 new patients. How many of those patients are staying in order to get recall exams in the next year? So it's possible we might find that this number is up to 1,000 the next year because these 400 patients, they were able to get them onto the active recall list, which that'd be ideal to find out. So we've also got a code here. I don't even know what it is. It's D0150P. I think that's something that they added, and that's another 100 patients. So it'd be interesting to find out, does that mean that there were actually 500 new patients, or is that a code that was inside of that one? I don't know. So there may have been as many as 500 new patients. Something we can also look at is the number of bite wings that were taken. They did 309 bite wings. So because you're doing bite wings at every other appointment, 670 divided by 2, yeah, that's going to be about that bite wing number. There's probably some FMXs that were done on here. So now what we can do is we can estimate the number of recall patients per year. Assuming that this number is correct, I think it's probably gone up a little bit for 2024, but we don't have those numbers. But let's assume that's about 800 to 900 that are going to be on the 2024 because of all these new patients. Keep in mind that not every patient is going to be coming back every year. So if you take the total number of periodic exams, or if you look at prophies, those give you kind of similar numbers. And we're going to divide that roughly by about 1.5. And the reason I like to divide it by 1.5 is because some patients are going to come back at 6 months, and some are going to come back every year, and some are going to be somewhere in between. And so the 1.5 number gives us somewhat of a reasonable estimate. So for the sake of this estimate, let's go ahead and say that there were 900 recall exams. So estimated number of recall patients were probably at about 600. Now, most dentists are going to need about 1,000 patients per year in order to run a profitable practice. Clearly, this dentist was running a profitable practice. However, in order to make it to that 1,000 number of patients, the seller has had to get a lot of new patients in. And so if you take the 600 and you add in the 400 new patients, that does get you to that 1,000 patient number. And so that's why this dentist is able to be profitable, even though estimated number of recall patients is a little bit low. So the thing is, if you buy a practice where there are less than 1,000 active patients, then you want to make sure that you're going to be able to get enough new patients to get you up to that 1,000 number. In this case, it seems like you're probably going to be able to do that based on the number of new patients that are coming in. And if you can work on the systems a little bit to try to keep as many of those patients in your recall system, then there's a chance you could grow this practice pretty fast, because 400 to 500 new patients per year is very high, especially for the amount of money she's spending on marketing. That's a very good sign. And so that shows you this practice is probably located in an area that's growing, probably has pretty good street visibility. And they probably have done a pretty good job with Google reviews and ranking on SEO. To get that kind of new patient number while only spending $40,000 a year is very good. Next thing we want to look at is yearly revenue per recall patient. Because we're basing this off of the 2023 number for recall patient, I'm going to take the 1.3 million that the seller did in 2023. So that is going to put us at a number of 2,166. That's a pretty high number for the amount of production that was done per recall patient. The reason this to me is a little bit of a red flag, when you take over the practice, if you are not able to achieve these new patient numbers, you might have a hard time replicating the production of the seller. From what I'm seeing so far, if you buy this practice, I'm not sure you're going to be able to replicate that 770 number in the first year, because that's just a really high net income number. But there's a pretty good chance that you can make at least 400,000 in your first year, maybe 500,000. Because that number is so high, even if you do a little worse than the seller was doing, you're still going to be doing probably quite a bit better than you're doing at your associate job. If you were looking at a practice where the seller was only making 400,000 a year, then you wouldn't have as much room to play with that net income number. It's not ideal that this yearly revenue per patient is as high as it is, but in this case scenario, because net income is so high, this still might be a decent practice to buy. And that's why you kind of have to look at the entire practice. You can't just look at a single number to get an idea if a practice is worth buying, because there's a lot of different factors you want to look at. Also, this new patient number is very much an indicator that this practice has the potential to grow.
Well, can I ask you a question? Sorry
Yeah,
to cut you off. When you did that calculation right now, you only did that of periodic exams, the 600? Where's that 600 from?
To get that 600, we looked at the number of prophy appointments and we divided that by 1.5. This was the revenue per recall patient.
Okay,
so this one isn't including new patients. Let's see what the production is if we include the new patients. So if we include the new patients, we're now down to $1,181 per patient. So that's if you include the new patients. Generally, I don't like to include new patients, but in this case, because there are so many new patients and the overall marketing spend is so low, then maybe in this case you would want to think of that number and include it. Do you know how long the seller has owned this practice for?
I think 5 years.
Interesting. Interesting. The fact that the seller has only owned the practice for 5 years.
But
So
the dentist,
did the seller start this practice or acquire this practice?
they started it, but then I think in 2021 acquired an older.
Do you have any
practice in
idea
2021.
how many patients they acquired when they acquired the practice? No. Because this number of new patients is so high, and the practice has only been open for 5 years, that might explain somewhat why the number of recall exams is so low, because they haven't had enough time to build up a huge recall base yet. If you were going to open up a practice in this city, this might actually be a decent city to do a startup in rather than just acquire a practice. I still think acquiring a practice is better than doing a startup for so many reasons, because you're going to be profitable starting out right away. But this number of new patients is just so much higher than I see in a lot of practices. If you're looking at a practice, you're probably not going to be looking at one with this many new patients per year unless the seller is spending significantly more than that $40,000 on marketing. So very interesting. Let's look at the number of crowns that were done at the practice. We're 318 crowns done. Next, we want to look at the number of fillings that were done. We're not seeing any amalgam, so we're just going to look at the resin codes. So about 600 fillings done at this practice. Right off the bat, that's a pretty good ratio.
What's like a normal number like of crowns you think? It's so hard to know.
Yeah. One thing I like to look at is how many fillings were done versus how many crowns were done. If you're looking at a practice where significantly more crowns than fillings were done, that's a good sign that the dentist is probably doing crowns on teeth that probably could have had fillings. If there's an MO that's not that deep, it's probably going to be fine to do a filling. You don't need to do a crown. But some dentists, because they know they get paid more for crowns, they'll do the crown on the tooth that really could have used an MO. And so the fact that we have 600 fillings, which is pretty much double the number of crowns, that's a good sign. For the number of patients at this practice, these seem like pretty reasonable numbers. It doesn't seem like they're dramatically overproducing. Let's see if they're doing any ortho, implants, or molar endo, because that gives us an idea of if the seller is doing any type of specialty work.
I think she's doing a lot of dentures.
When practices have a lot of new patients, oftentimes that means a lot of dentures, because especially if you're in an area of the country where there's a lot of decay, if you have new patients, you're going to be doing a lot of extractions and a lot of dentures. So it'd be interesting also to look at how many extractions are being done. Just for curiosity's sake, 59 dentures. That's a lot of dentures. And perio root scaling, there was 273 perio appointments. So that is very high.
Because it used to be a hygienist, so I'm pretty sure they're down with the
Yeah, the seller used to be a hygienist. So, okay, yeah, that's probably why there's so many scalings. That makes sense. We have a lot of partials too. Yeah, like about 40, 50 partials, it looks like. There were 322 simple extractions. That's quite a bit. That's 5% of production is the simple extractions. So that's obviously for those dentures, 60 dentures. But I'm not seeing a lot of specialty work here. Here's comprehensive ortho, one comprehensive ortho case. So that's nothing to worry about. Let's look at implants. Those are usually in the 6,000s. Surgical implant placement, 16 custom abutments. So 2 implants were done and there were 16 that were referred out. Let's look at molar endo. The endodontic codes are usually around the D3000s. So there were 18 anterior endos, 29 premolar endos, and the molar endo code is 330, which is not on here. So 0 molar endo cases. All right, so that's it. We have filled out the sheet. It's good news that there's really not any specialty work being done here. So if you did later want to add in either molar endo, ortho, or implants, those are huge growth opportunities. The seller is clearly referring all of that out right now. And it is interesting to note that the seller only restored 18 implants, but did like 60 partials. So it sounds like we have a seller that doesn't really like to refer things out, but also doesn't want to do implants.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of those partials could have been implants, but everyone diagnoses differently. Overall, my initial take on this practice is the seller is doing a lot of general dentistry And the new patient number right now is really bringing up the number of procedures that are being done. Having now looked at the production by procedure report, we're starting to realize that a lot of the seller's production is actually coming from dentures and extractions. And that is because of this high new patient number in an area of the country that has a lot of decay. That also explains why the periodic oral eval number might be a little bit lower than we expected, because denture patients probably are not coming back that often for periodic oral evals because they have dentures now. I mean, you can try to get them to come back and you can try to clean the dentures off ideally, but most denture patients aren't going to come back until something breaks.
I do have a question. So do you think that's kind of sketchy for that amount of new patients to have just 2 hygienists for that year?
No, I don't think so, because the hygienists are also doing new patients.
Yeah.
And doing the new patient exams. And they're doing so many scalings at this office.
Yeah, that's true.
And scalings take longer than a prophy.
That's true.
And so that explains why there needs to be 2.5 hygienists, because there were like 300 scalings. This is a very interesting practice, especially with it only being 5 years. I'm expecting that the equipment is probably in pretty decent condition. Especially if you buy an older practice, you might be getting really outdated equipment. So if you are going to pay $1.1 million for the practice, which is what we think the asking price is, that's pretty decent. 1.1 million for a practice that's doing 1.5. Oftentimes, once you get above that 1 million number, practices tend to often sell closer to 100% of the previous year's production. So I would not have been surprised if we heard that this practice was being offered for 1.5 million. Now, would I pay 1.5 million for this practice? I don't know. But if you can get it for 1.1, that's actually a pretty decent price for what you're getting here.
What would be your line? Like 1.2? So they're saying that, so I don't know. It's like 1.1, 1.2. I'm hoping 1.1.
So the question is this a fair purchase price? A big question we're going to have is going to be this rent. Because the seller owns the building, sometimes they'll list the practice slightly below market value with the intention of having a high rent number and then getting their money back on rent. This is going to be a big negotiation point, is how much you're paying in monthly rent. Remember, we want to keep that less than 5% of production. So assuming you're able to maintain that 1.5 number, the most you're going to want to pay is about $75,000 per year, which puts you at about $6,000 per month. So if you can get monthly rent for $6,000 or less, then I think it's probably a pretty decent deal. If the seller's trying to make you pay significantly more than that, then you might want to question if it's worth it. And then the other thing to keep in mind is, because the seller owns the building, you want to have the option to purchase that building at some point. If the building is pretty big, which it sounds like it's a reasonably big building, 5 ops option to expand, there's an upper level. The difference between buying a practice and buying real estate is that when you buy real estate, you have to have a down payment. When you buy a practice, you don't have to have a down payment. The banks will actually usually give you working capital, which is money that you get in addition to the practice loan. So it's kind of the opposite of putting a down payment, because they know practices are so successful, they will give you more money than the asking price. But when you buy a building, real estate, the banks want you to put something down, usually at least 10, maybe 20%. So if this building is selling for $1.5 to $3 million, you might need to have $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 to put down in order to buy the building. So if you're in a situation where you could put that down right away and still have an emergency fund saved up, then it might make sense to try to buy the building right away. But if you don't yet have that kind of money, the best thing to do is negotiate a way where you can pay rent for 1 to 2 years and then have the option to purchase. And then if you're making $700,000 a year, you're going to have to pay back the practice loan, probably something like $120,000 per year. So that's going to leave you with a profit of about $500,000. Assuming your living expenses are $150 per year, you're paying maybe $150 in taxes, you're going to be able to save up maybe $200,000 a year. So 1 to 2 years working at this practice, you could save up enough to have enough to put the down payment and then buy the real estate. So that's one option if you don't yet have enough money for that down payment. But overall, I say this is a very interesting practice. It's definitely a very interesting city, getting that many new patients. I would say definitely go take a look at it. Have you gone through and seen the practice yet?
I've driven by it.
Okay. Yeah, definitely you should go visit. Always, if you have the opportunity to go visit a practice, go visit it. The more practices you visit, the better. the more you're going to learn. I would try to visit at least 5 or 6 practices before you buy one if you can, just so you get an idea of what you're looking for. But overall, I think this is a very, very interesting practice. The 2.5 hygienist is great. The annual revenue is great. The number of recalls is a little bit low, but that's because there's so many new patients. You're doing these dentures, you're doing the extractions. There's a lot of room for growth in ortho implants or molar endo if you wanted to eventually add that on. There's room for expansion in the building if you did want to have an associate later. The seller, the reason for leaving is retirement, which is the ideal reason. Overall, it's a decent practice. Did you have any questions about anything?
So what's like next steps?
So next step here, you haven't visited the practice yet. So next step is going to visit it, look at it.
But you're not looking at anything, like you're talking about looking at the schedule and stuff.
Yeah, I'd look at the schedule. We're trying to verify exactly how many recall patients there are. We'll look at the schedule. Look at some of the work, go back and look at some of the x-rays, look at the charts, see, does it seem like this dentist is being pretty ethical in the things that they're treatment planning? Does everything look like it's above board?
That's funny, because I thought when you said go look at it, you're just like, oh, looking at it, look at the rooms, but you're talking about like...
No, you're going in the building, you are like investigating. Like, you're about to spend $1.1 million. You're going to check every little square foot of this office and dig into the details. Now, before you make the initial offer in the practice, you don't have to do everything. After you make the offer, you're going to have probably about 2 months for due diligence. And during that time, you're going to want to dig even deeper to make sure that this is actually what you want to be buying. You want to sit in the chairs, make sure they all lean back properly. You want to try to take pictures and videos when you go in. Honestly, I would just have my phone on. I would walk around the office and video everything, zoom in on any product numbers, serial numbers, so you can go back later and look it up online to see how much it's worth, if it's likely going to need replaced soon. Make sure that the suction and everything is working with the hand pieces. Make sure the computers are reasonably modern, up to date. Look at the x-ray equipment, see what kind of things are you likely going to have to replace. Now, if you were buying a practice where the dentist had been there for 40 years, there's probably going to be a lot of equipment that needs replaced. Because this dentist has only been here for 5 years, it's probably going to be pretty decent. You're probably going to be able to walk in and everything's going to be ready to go. But you want to look into that and check and see, does it look like there's going to be any expenses up front? Is there going to need to be any renovations done to the building? Look at how much parking there is out front. Make sure there's going to be enough parking for the number of patients you think you're going to be seeing. Drive around, make sure it's in a nice area of town. Get an idea of what the visibility is like from the street. You're just trying to learn as much as you can about this practice before you make the offer on the practice. Then once you decide, if you decide that this is a practice that you want to go forward on, the next step is going to be the letter of intent. And that is where you make an official offer on the practice. The letter of intent is not a legally binding document. So when you submit the letter of intent, you are not yet buying the practice. What you're doing is you're saying, I want to buy the practice for this purchase price on this date, and these are the conditions under which I want to buy the practice. You are then going to have some time to secure your financing, find your lawyer, do your due diligence, and make sure that it's worth buying. Usually there's going to be some parts of the contract, part of the LOI, that say, if the business is not up to the standards that were presented in these documents, then that gives you an out. You are often going to have to put a deposit, some earnest money down. Generally, that number is going to be something like $3,000 to $10,000 that you are giving to the seller, just so the seller knows that you're serious about this practice. If you back out once you have submitted a letter of intent and it's without cause, there's not a good reason to back out. If you back out without cause, the seller gets to keep that money. But if when you are doing your due diligence on the practice, you find out that the seller had been committing some sort of malpractice, or that these numbers that the seller sent you were falsified in some way, or there's something about the practice that the seller had been misrepresenting, you are able to then back out and you get your deposit back. Definitely a very interesting practice. Next steps are going to be going to visit and making sure we get that 2024 production by procedure. We want to go through and see if the number of recall patients have changed at all, as well as just making sure the numbers make sense and that nothing new has been done. We want to make sure that the seller, for instance, hasn't started doing a lot of ortho or anything like that. If the seller has introduced ortho at the practice, usually Invisalign, that can make things a little bit difficult because ortho cases last, a year or more sometimes. If you buy a practice where there are unfinished ortho cases, that can be a problem. But overall, very interesting practice, and good luck.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
I hope you have found this useful. Remember, the practice evaluation checklist is available for free. You can find it in the description. If you are looking at a practice of your own and are looking for some assistance, if you want someone to look at it with you to validate your potential purchase and make sure this is a good option, or to have someone tell you, hey, don't buy this, it's not worth it. That's what I do. I offer evaluations. Reach out and I would love to look at the practice with you. Good luck on your journey to practice ownership.